Hey everyone, this is Adam White from CapTech Consulting, and I wanted to show off this really neat invoked action that Reagan Walker and I at CapTech Consulting have been working on over the past couple of weeks in our spare time. We were inspired by the call to action a couple weeks back from Alex Edelstein to create records from a CSV action that Narinder Singh fulfilled, but I wanted to basically do the inverse of that, which is create a CSV file from a collection of records. There have been a lot of times where out of the box Salesforce reporting just doesn't necessarily cut it, and a lot of times I have to run custom SQL queries to fulfill some client needs. Well, this will let us do that, which are pretty cool. It also lets us do a lot of other things like generating CSV files on a schedule, posting to chatter groups on a schedule, letting folks select from a collection of records to generate CSV files. Lots of cool use cases. I'm going to cover a couple that are in our blog post just so you guys get a little bit more detail aside from screenshots. So the first one is a action that will post a file from a collection of, let's see, contacts to post to a chatter group and also to a account. So we're going to walk through it here just so you guys can understand all the different steps and components involved. So essentially what we're doing here is we're grabbing a record ID. This is a screen flow. Grabbing the record ID from an account, getting the details of that record, which is actually going to be replaced. We won't even need to do this in summer 20 because we will be essentially getting it for free. I think they called it soaking. So we won't need to do this step in summer 20, which is awesome. And next, we'll ask the user, hey, what kind of report do you want to generate? Again, we're not really actually doing any sort of decisions off this. It's just a little demo, but for this case, we're gonna generate a fun little CSV for contacts' birthdays for an account. So then we'll do a get, and we're basically going to store these 4 fields, well, technically 5 since we're grabbing the ID, in the collection. Make sure we store all records. And then part of the requirements for this is that we need to post it to a chatter group. So we need to look up that chatter group ID, the object's collaboration group, with a name of unofficial SF group. We really only need the ID, so we don't need to fiddle with any of the other data down here. And so one of the neat things about this CSV action is it can take a collection of text IDs or text strings so that if you wanted to relate the file to multiple records, you could do that. So here we're going to take the record ID that launched the flow, and we're going to take that ID that we just looked up, and we're going to add them both to a collection, a text collection of IDs here. And we're going to open up this CSV action. I talk a lot about the inputs and outputs in the blog post, so I won't really cover them too much in depth here, but your title is required and your collection is required. And you could put in a formula, a flow formula here to give it dynamic naming. And then your collection here. We don't really need to specify a field string here, but one important thing to note is if we go back here and we look at our get step, if you pick store all fields, which is new to the last Salesforce release, the action is going to pass in all the fields for that object. And that's just a little idiosyncrasy of the way that the action works. So if you pass any sort of collection into a subflow or apex action, Flow isn't going to know which fields you need, so it's just going to give you everything. So you're definitely going to want, if you select that action, you're definitely going to want to specify the fields that you want in the CSV here, else it's going to give you everything. And then for the linked record IDs, we're going to put in that collection variable that we just created. And we'll use the out-of-the-box post to chatter action with our message, the target name, which is the group name, and then we're going to store the ID of that chatter post here. And so one little quirk about relating a file to a chatter post is it doesn't actually use content document links. It uses another object called feed attachment. So what you would do here is you would put in your text ID that we just created from the previous action to create the chatter post. The feed entity ID is the chatter post ID. Your record ID is actually the content version ID of the file. So we would go in here, we would select our action from the CSV, and then output the content version ID. The type would be content. And then what we would have here is a nice little post to the chatter group. And so if you didn't want to relate it to the group, so this is actually relating it to both the chatter post and the group. If you didn't want to relate it to the group, you could just take out that linked ID in the assignment step here. So the next example I'm going to show off is aggregate query support and related field support. So both of these basically need the execute SOQL action that we've been actively working on as well. So first of all, I'll talk about the aggregate query support. So aggregate queries are basically queries that allow you to roll up, summarize, and do things with records in Salesforce without needing to throw it into Excel to get your counts and mins and maxes and things like that. It also allows you to create what are called aliases for those roll-ups. So if you don't do something like that, you'll get some weird outputs that aren't exactly user-friendly. So we'll talk about that in a second. So let's talk about the execute SOQL piece. So we'll open up our action here. So as you may or may not know, the execute SOQL action takes one input, which is basically a query string, which you can use in a formula field or a text template. I like text templates because you don't have to worry about your parentheses and your apostrophes. So we'll take our first one here. This is an aggregate query. We're getting a count of all the types of accounts in our dev box. So you'll notice here I have a space and then number of accounts. This is called an alias. So in our CSV, we'll have two columns, number of accounts and type. Otherwise, if you don't do this, you'll see some nasty looking expression 0 looking column name, which you know, it's fine for you, but it may not be fine for your end users. Make sure it's in plain text mode. So I mentioned the blog post. There is a little bug right now in the spring release where if you go in and change it, so let's say I have rich text and I hit plain text, this is what's going to be sent into SOQL. So you want to go back into your rich text, copy and paste it into plain text, so that if you make any changes, it'll revert back to rich text and then go back to plain text. So just keep that in mind. And then you'll go in here. You don't need to do anything with your field string for aggregate queries. You specify your title and your collection, which is your output of the execute SOQL action. And then it'll output a nice little table here. Oh, sorry, that's the related one. We have our number of accounts and our type. So related fields, as you are probably aware, it's just a way of going through relationships to get a related records values. Something that Flow can't do very easily. So I'm going to show you this very basic little query here, which I just created a custom lookup field from account to another account called Ultimate Parent Company. And we want to return its name. And we pass in the record ID of the account that launched it. And then the only real difference here with configuring the CSV action is this field string. We basically want to pass in all the fields that are in that select part of the statement exactly as it appears in the select statement. Maybe in a future release we'll be able to dynamically know based off of the select query, but for now this is what you need to do to get those related fields. And then you'll basically get something that looks like this. You'll get your account name and your related field value. So neat little feature, super helpful for not having to create formula fields and things like that to show within collections. So I hope you like it. So the next thing I wanted to show off was our platform event support. And this is a little more advanced, so don't feel too bad if you don't get it right off the bat, but it does require a little bit of research about platform events, which I coincidentally had to do as well. So you're going to want to use this when your output file is a lot larger than most operations. So it's kind of hard to say because it's a combination of how many fields you're including and how many records you're including. So we included some error handling if you hit limits in synchronous mode to flip it into asynchronous mode. So what you're going to do here, first, I included some instructions in the blog post here, but you're definitely going to want to create your platform event type first. We included some instructions in the comments and also the blog post. You're going to want to call it CSV export event, and you're going to want to create some custom fields for the platform event. So it's going to be very similar to creating a new custom object, but it's got to be named exactly like this, so it matches the code. So when a platform event is generated, these custom fields are going to be filled in. So once you've configured that platform event, we'll go back into the flow here. Sorry, let me find the right window. So this is a pretty basic one just to show off an example. So we're going to be generating a CSV file from a collection generated from flow. We're going to wait for the platform event to fire. And then once the platform event is received, we will basically assign the variables from that platform event to a flow variable. And then we're going to look up the content version ID or the content document links from that content document ID. And then we're going to pass it into the unofficial SF send HTML email action and include all those content document links that we found in the email so that we can send out those attachments. So let's drill in. Pretty basic lookup here. We populate our gets with the fields that we want in the CSV file. The steps here are going to be similar to the other steps. The only real difference here is we're going to populate this execute async identifier with the interview ID. So the way you would do that is you would just pick flow as your global variable, your interview ID, and that's all you need. And then you put in the record ID of the file, of the record you want to relate the file to. So here's your pause event. So I have no conditions on this pause. Your resume is here. So you click a platform event message received. You pick platform event type is CSV export event. Your condition is going to be, you pick your custom field on the platform event, source unique ID is equal to flow interview ID. And we're going to store it in an output variable. So these are kind of similar to other record variables in Flow. The only difference is it's of type CSV export. So when you create your record variable, you're just going to pick CSV export event like you would any other custom object. And so there's a little quirk that I saw in the documentation that you can't easily access platform event responses throughout the flow. So what you're going to have to do is you're going to have to assign variables from the response record to whatever text variables you need. So here I'm storing the content document ID in a text variable. You pick your platform event and you pick the field that you want. And then our next step, we're going to look up all the content document links related to that content document. And again, I would really recommend, if you're not familiar with the file structure, to do some research on that so you're a little bit more comfortable here. But you're going to select all records. And this is going to store all the content document links for that CSV, which will pass nicely into the send HTML email action here. And then you'll be all set. Now, these are a little hard to debug since when you debug them, you basically get a stuck for waiting screen. So I don't have any great advice for checking the platform events. I think there are some handy features coming in summer 20. But what I did was I created tasks or activities based off of the path that this flow takes so that I know whether or not the platform event was received or not. And then you can always check the flow list views. So if you go back here, you'll see paused interviews. You'll know that it worked if you see your flows getting stuck in a pause status. So you have your active flows on the top, and then you've got paused flows on the bottom. Paused flow interviews. So it would be in here if it was paused. If you guys have any questions about this, feel free to post in the success community under the automation group. Thanks.